Hey kids, it's Chef Jack again. Thanks for joining me for the next installment of our History of Comics tribute to Jack Kirby. So far we've talked about Jack Kirby's legacy of characters in his comic book series, but now we're going to tackle a completely different part of comic book history. We're going to be looking at the controversy of Jack Kirby versus Stan Lee. When you're a kid and you first get into comic books, inevitably you learn who Stan Lee is. You learn how Stan is perhaps the single most significant author of the pop culture universe in which we all now live. He's the guy who, in a manic burst of imagination nearly 60 years ago, brought into being the Amazing Spider-Man and the Avengers and the X-Men and the Incredible Hulk and the Fantastic Four and dozens of other Marvel characters and Marvel titles he so famously and consequentially penned at Marvel Comics during the early days. But there always comes a time when somebody more knowledgeable than you, an older kid at school or the guy who runs the local comic shop or a blogger with a vendetta, will let you in on a secret. You know Stan Lee, right? Well, let me fill you in on the real shit about him. He screwed over Kirby, he screwed over Ditko, he screwed over all those guys. They were the real creative geniuses behind Marvel. Stan Lee stole everything from him, and now he's rich, and he's famous, and he did it on the backs of the guys who did all the hard work. What you get told is that Stan Lee is nothing more than a talentless hack, a huckster, a loudmouth in an empty suit. And when you ask them to prove it, they inevitably can provide evidence that what they say is true. It makes you begin to question your assumptions. You have to decide for yourself, what is your personal take on this subject? And in any case, your perception of Stan Lee is never the same again. The two sides of this controversy have become amazingly polarizing, with fans basically dividing right up the middle, either supporting Stan Lee or supporting Jack Kirby. And there's, to be honest, there's no real easy solution to it. There really isn't. Personally, I believe that Jack Kirby was robbed of all the credit he should have received. But before I continue this, I want to point something out. Stan Lee's position as a comic book legend is not in doubt. He absolutely deserves every ounce of his fame, every single cent that's in his bank account. He deserves his endless number of fans. He deserves the glory. Stan Lee does not need to defend himself. He certainly doesn't need me to do it. His achievements speak for themselves. And I want to start out with that statement because I'm about to drive a point home with a sledgehammer, and otherwise what follows might get ugly. I want to be clear. Jack Kirby created Marvel Comics, and I'm spelling comics with a small c. Jack Kirby created the pictures, he created the characters, he created the stories. But it was Stan Lee who created Marvel Comics, capitalized. Lee created the shared universe. Lee created the business empire. Anyone who has ever run a business or followed the lives of a great entrepreneur know that this is just as creative an enterprise as writing and drawing stories. So while I'm about to show exactly what happened between Lee and Kirby, I don't want anybody to mistake the fact that Lee deserves the accolades he is getting today. Let's get to the heart of the controversy. To do so, I'm basically going to be concentrating on the Golden Age Fantastic Four title, just, because it's easier to concentrate on one title than to jump around a lot of them. When you look at the credits of these issues, the early issues of Fantastic Four, they all say, written by Stan Lee, drawn by Jack Kirby. And that appears nice and simple. In the book, The Origins of Marvel Comics, and in a lot of other interviews, Lee would say that he would come up with the broad ideas, not necessarily the specifics. He'd make big, broad ideas, and then he would hand them over to Jack Kirby and the other writers at Marvel, who would then transform them into specific comic book pages. The thing is, there are several problems with Lee's story. First, both before and after the early 1960s, Stan Lee was not exactly known to be the most creative person. Jack Kirby, on the other hand, was well known for producing all kinds of big ideas. And second, Stan Lee was far too busy to write everything. And he'd often just, when he did deliver ideas, it was the faintest outline of an idea. Certainly nothing that you could claim co-writer or, writer or co-writer credit for. In one particular letter to a fan, Stan Lee wrote, "Fantastic Four is easily our favorite book here at the Marvel Bullpen. It is my baby and I love it. People have asked for original scripts, but actually we don't have any. I wrote the story, I go over it with Jack, he draws it up based on our hasty conferences." Note that phrase, hasty conferences. "And then with his drawings in front of me, I write the captions and the dialogue, usually right on the original artwork. It seems to work out well." Stan would often just phone in a suggestion and Jack would do the rest, delivering the pages for dialogue to be added. For example, according to both Kirby and Lee, the ultimate genesis for Fantastic Four number 48, 49, and 50, which was the very first appearance of Galactus, was when Lee called Kirby up on the phone and said something like, "Hey Jack, how about the next time we have Fantastic Four fight God?" And, Jack Kirby responded by bringing in Galactus. I mean, famously, the first time Stan Lee even saw the Silver Surfer was when he asked, "So who's this guy?" About Jack Kirby, Lee has actually said, "Very often I didn't even know what the hell he was going to give me. I'd get some pages of artwork, and I wrote the copy and turned it into whatever story I wanted it to be, but it was like doing the crossword puzzle. I'd try to figure out what the illustrations meant, and then I'd put in the dialogue and the captions." According to Kirby, he would use blue pencil to put notes in the margins of his artwork with suggestions for dialogue. Stan would then add the actual dialogue and quite often would completely ignore what Kirby wanted. To be fair, Kirby apparently ignored Lee just as often. According to John Romita Sr., Kirby was later able to claim with a straight face that Lee never wrote anything except what Jack put into his margin notes, because Jack Kirby never bothered to read the comic books after he turned his art into Stan Lee. In 1968, Castle Frankenstein magazine published an interview with Stan Lee in which he said, and I quote, "Some artists, such as Jack Kirby, need no plot at all. I mean, I'll just say to Jack, let's have the next villain be Dr. Doom. Or I may not even say that much. He may tell me. And then he goes home and he does it. He is so good at plots, I am sure that he's 1,000 times better than I. He just makes up the plots in these stories. All I do is a little editing. I may tell him he's gone too far in one direction or the other. Of course, occasionally I will give him a plot, and we're practically both the writers on those things." It seems really clear in interviews like these that when Stan Lee says writing, what he means is adding the dialogue to the finished artwork. But it's also just as clear that when Jack Kirby says writing, he means deciding what happens from one panel to the next and adding the notes in the margin as needed. As to Lee's personal creativity, there is a lot of evidence, mostly anecdotal, that it just didn't match Kirby's at all. Stan Goldberg, for example, who wrote for Marvel in the late 60s, once said, "One time I was in Stan's office and I told him, I don't have another plot. Well, I was having a little writer's block and I just couldn't come up with anything. I was hoping Stan could give me an idea to work from. Stan got out of his chair, walked over to me, looked me in the face, and said very seriously, 'I don't ever want to hear you say you can't think up another plot.' And then he walked back and sat down in his chair. He didn't think he needed to tell me anything more." In contrast, Goldberg said this about Kirby, quote, "Jack would sit there at lunch and would tell us these great ideas about what he was going to do next. It was like the ideas were bursting from every pore. It was very interesting because he was a fountain of great ideas." Steve Ditko said, "The fact is, we had no story or idea discussion about Spider-Man books before issue 26, up to when I left the book. Stan never knew what was in my stories until I took in the penciled story cover and my script. Saul Brodsky, his personal assistant, would take it all from me and brought it into Stan's office. I would leave Marvel without once seeing or talking to Stan." Legendary artist Wally Wood goes even further. He said, "I'll never say that Stan Lee isn't a smart man. I mean, he did come up with two surefire ideas. The first one was, why not have the artists do all the hard work? And the second was, always sign your name up on the top. Big." And the rest was history. Stan Lee, of course, became rich and famous over the bodies of people like Bill and Jack, unquote. By Bill and Jack, of course, he means Bill Everett and Jack Kirby. Bill Everett, for those of you who don't know, created Namor the Submariner. Jack Kirby, of course, created a lot more than that. Gil Kane had a similar opinion of Stan Lee, and I quote, "On each page from 1964 to 1970, next to every single panel, Jack wrote extensive margin notes explaining to Lee what was taking place in the story. It took Jack about 2 weeks to create these pages. It took Lee as little as 2 hours to add the dialogue to Jack's art." Jack Kirby was only paid as an artist, but he felt that he should have been paid much more because he was also contributing story ideas. He believed that he'd been cheated, so he did finally leave Marvel. Years later, in the 1980s, Jack Kirby was fighting to get some of his original artwork back from Marvel, and the two sides became polarized, as I mentioned. Some fans clearly felt that Stan had done everything. Others supported Kirby's claim that Stan had done nothing. Still more felt that their contributions were basically equal. The battle rages to this day. So, in the end, who's right? To be perfectly blunt, Jack Kirby deserved far more credit than he ever received. Now, that said, some things should be pointed out, namely the Black Panther, the X-Men, and Spider-Man. While Kirby did come up with the rough idea for the Black Panther, he wanted to call the character the Coal Tiger. Yeah, the Coal Tiger. In addition, the costume Kirby came up with for this character was, in a word, utterly ridiculous. Lee has said that he unilaterally changed the character's look and the character's name to make him simultaneously more heroic and more menacing, and to seem like he was more powerful, something that no one can deny is exactly what happened with the character in the long run. In regard to the X-Men, there is definitive concrete proof that this was one of the few occasions that Stan Lee brought a fully formed concept to Jack Kirby and said, "Draw this, please." Kirby's contributions to the X-Men's creation was their look, and that was all. Lastly, while Jack Kirby claims credit for creating a quote-unquote early version of Spider-Man, the truth is his early version shares one thing and only one thing in common with the version to come later, and that's the name. Everything else about the character was created by Steve Ditko, which unfortunately means that claiming credit for things you didn't do is not an exclusive trait of Stan Lee. Despite my earlier statement that Stan Lee doesn't need me to defend him, I'm going to defend him a little right now. Stan Lee's fame does not and should not rest on the strength of his writing. Rather, his ultimate talent was as an editor and as a promoter. Nobody has ever promoted the comic book industry like Stan the Man did. That's where his genius lay. This entire Lee versus Kirby controversy arises because of the perception that Lee personally, on his own and by his own devices, screwed Kirby over and made himself rich in the process, leaving Kirby penniless. Lee is portrayed as a con man and a huckster who has little to no input in the comics that made him rich other than signing his name larger than anybody else, while Kirby is portrayed as the hard-working genius who conceived, drew, and wrote everything with little to show for it at the end of his life. The way the comic book industry was set up was not Stan Lee's fault. The work-for-hire credo ensured that most creative types, Jack Kirby included, would have little to show other than their contracted pay rates. And the truth is, at the time, Kirby was the highest paid comic book writer in history. Stan Lee completely changed the way comic books were perceived by the general public. And he did it so that it would be that way forever. Without his vision, no comic book, Marvel, DC, Independent, it doesn't matter. No comic book would be seen as the form of entertainment they are today. In a world without Stan Lee, the average comic book reader is what he was in the 1940s and 50s, an 8 to 14-year-old boy who gave up comics the moment he discovered girls. The artists would still be working until their eyesight failed because there would be no medical or financial retirement benefits. And there certainly wouldn't be anything like I Love Comics, where two highly educated and dedicated brothers who are fans of the comic book medium spend hours and hours and hours researching, recording, and presenting videos about comic books because they love them. Because they love them more than just about any other form of entertainment on the planet. And why? Because nobody would care. Nobody would care. That's what Stan Lee did for comics. He made people care about them. Jack Kirby will always be seen as the person who was treated shabbily by Marvel Comics. But that doesn't mean that Stan Lee was the villain of the piece. And he certainly wasn't responsible for Jack Kirby's life circumstances at the time of his death. Kirby was bursting with ideas. He was a genius as both a writer and an artist. But even his closest friends said that he was also, and had always been, an unpleasant, irascible, sarcastic, pushy, bitter, impatient man who could hold a grudge for decades and who was distrustful of everyone, even his friends, sometime to the point of paranoia. And to be honest, a lot of the financial problems Jack Kirby faced in his later years were the fault of one person and one person only: Jack Kirby. Meanwhile, Stan Lee was the guy who never met a stranger he didn't like. He had a kind word and a smile for everybody, and who is now living the high life in Hollywood, glad-handing it with the celebrities. Sympathy for Jack and jealousy of Stan leaves us with the perception that Lee is a dishonest snake who doesn't deserve his current place in society because that's the narrative everybody wants to hear. I honestly think that when Stan Lee finally dies, and that might not be as far off as we imagine, given that, the man's in his 90s and he's currently not in the best of health. I honestly think that after Stan Lee dies, the acrimony that's directed toward him by so many fans is going to die down somewhat. So there you go, kids. Our look at the Jack Kirby Stan Lee controversy. What did you think? Did you agree with me? Did you disagree with me? Do you think I'm full of it? Do you have information I didn't have? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the video, go ahead and click the like button. If you really like the video, share it with your friends so maybe they can come over and like the video. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to hit that little notification bell that's next to the subscribe button. That way you don't miss any of our videos. If you really like what we're doing here, you want to help us keep the lights on, we have a Patreon page and a VidMe page. They're both linked below. There is exclusive Patreon content. But even if you don't, I want to thank you for your time and your attention. I do love doing these History of Comics videos. And I know that there's, 4 of you out there who also love watching them. And I appreciate every single one of you. I want you to know. Anyway, I will see you again for the next History of Comics video. Thank you very, very much for watching.